Welcome to topic 8.6, Biodiversity. An ecosystem is a complex set of variables and phenomena that are all interconnected and influential upon one another. Organisms interact both with each other in the same species and with other species that occupy the same habitat. Each of those organisms has a different role or responsibility to play within that habitat. There are abiotic factors like wind, light, nutrients in the soil, even components of topography like whether or not there are mountains or valleys or rivers, as well as weathering and erosion. There are also biotic factors such as the producers that introduce energy into ecosystems, the consumers that rely upon that energy, and then ultimately the decomposers that return those nutrients that the producers and the consumers had back to the earth to be reutilized. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the concept of biodiversity. Biodiversity is a measurable, quantifiable characteristic about an ecosystem. We can do so by considering two variables. The first is the variety of species that exist in that habitat. In other words, how many different kinds of living things are found in a given area. The second variable is what is the relative abundance of each of those species. Is, for example, a habitat dominated mostly by a particular species, or is there a relatively equal proportion of different types of organisms? There's actually an equation that we can use called Simpson's Diversity Index, whereby we can actually calculate the biodiversity of an ecosystem. That would then allow us to compare biodiversities of different ecosystems and determine relatively which ecosystems are more or less biodiverse. The importance of biodiversity can be better understood when we consider that ecosystems that are more biodiverse are generally more resistant and resilient to ecosystem disturbances. Ecosystem disturbances include things like fires, floods, drought, volcanic eruptions, even insect outbreaks, and diseases. When we say that an ecosystem is more resistant to a particular disturbance, we're saying that it won't suffer the effects of that disturbance at the outset as severely. When we say that an ecosystem is resilient to a disturbance, that's a measure of how well that ecosystem will recover after the disturbance has occurred. So resistance is essentially before the disturbance takes place, and then resilience is after it takes place. A more biodiverse ecosystem means that there's going to be more long-term overall stability to that ecosystem. Every organism in an ecosystem has a role to play within that ecosystem. We refer to that as an organism's ecological niche. An ecological niche includes two variables. The first is the resources that that organism requires in order for survival from its habitat. What kind of soil quality it needs, how much water it needs, what kind of food it needs. Those are essentially what this first bullet point refers to. What does it need from its ecosystem? The second one is what does it give back to the ecosystem? What is its role, or what are its responsibilities? What are its functions in an ecosystem? We know that producers are responsible for incorporating inorganic carbon into organic molecules, thereby introducing energy into a trophic structure. We also know that decomposers are critical in returning the nutrients in deceased organisms back to their biogeochemical cycling so that they can be reutilized again in the future. Some species have a particularly important role to play in their ecosystem, and we're going to take a look at two examples of such in a moment: Keystone species and ecosystem engineers. When observing any ecosystem, it's pretty simple for us to determine which species is the most abundant. It's the one that's most numerous, that's also most conspicuous. But simply being a dominant species is not necessarily a measure of how important the species is. Being the most abundant doesn't automatically mean that you're the most important species in a habitat. Keystone species are a great example to illustrate this. Keystone species are important because, relative to their proportion in the population, they serve a disproportionately important role in the function of that ecosystem. They serve critical roles even though they may be few in numbers. We call them keystone species because, like a keystone in an arch, if that keystone were to be removed, the stability for all of the subsequent stones below them would then begin to falter. In other words, removal of a keystone species is usually detrimental to the entire ecosystem because of the ripple effects that result. We're going to watch a short video from SciShow that's going to illustrate a few more examples of keystone species.
The original keystone refers to a wedge-shaped slab at the peak of a stone arc. If you remove the keystone, you risk the whole thing tumbling down. And some ecosystems work the same way, relying on one keystone species. In biology, keystone species have a disproportionately large impact on their habitat given their size or numbers. Their daily activities affect all kinds of other species, directly or indirectly. And a change in their numbers can cause a trophic cascade, where effects ripple through the ecosystem, often in surprising ways. Take the gray wolves of Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. Their numbers dropped to zero around the early 1930s, mostly because of hunting. But in 1995, wolves were reintroduced to the park, and the wolves' impact has been monitored ever since. Turns out that impact is seriously important. The wolves' absence and reintroduction changed Yellowstone in large and often surprising ways, right down to how the rivers flow. For one thing, wolves prey on elk, and the elk know it, so their behavior changes when wolves are in the area. Elk are generally nomadic, staying on the move as they munch on plants. But without any wolves around, the elk became much less cautious, preferring to settle down and eat a lot in one place at a time. The elk even ate all the way down to the riverbank, somewhere they wouldn't dare linger if there were wolves around. Instead of eating a little bit from a lot of different plants, they ate so much at a time that aspen and cottonwood trees declined, and so did the riverside willows that beavers and some songbirds depend on. And beavers are also keystone species because of their special engineering talents. Their dams slow the flow of rivers, preventing floods and offering a wide range of habitats for all kinds of species. Ever since wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone, willows have grown better, beaver colonies have increased from just 1 to 9, and songbirds are flourishing too. Elk numbers declined at first, but now seem to have stabilized. And bison numbers are up, probably because of decreased competition from the elk. Research is ongoing to assess the wolves' long-term impact, considering the many subtle interconnections in this complex ecosystem. But as top predators, it's clear that the presence, absence, and then reintroduction of wolves has resonated throughout Yellowstone. And research into other wolf habitats will help work out what's unique to Yellowstone and what can be applied elsewhere. Elephants also do a lot to manage their environment, from what goes on in their mouths to what comes out the other end. They're sometimes known as the mega gardeners of the forest. For example, without African forest elephants, a single species of acacia tree tends to dominate African forests. It grows fast and shuts out the light from other plants, and the elephants help counter that. They sometimes knock down acacia in their search for food, opening up space and a critical shaft for light. Other plant species seize their chance, adding to the forest's biodiversity. The smaller branches that they knock down provide hidey holes for lizards, which are more diverse in places where elephants roam. When reaching for leaves or fruit, they'll often knock off a bunch more, and these windfalls get picked up by smaller ground dwellers like warthogs, as well as the kudu, which is a type of antelope. All this eating results in plenty of dung, around a metric ton every week, and all that poop becomes a mini ecosystem all by itself, since it's rich in nutrients that the elephants couldn't process. Fungi live in it, as do insects like beetle larvae, crickets, and spiders. In 2009, 3 species of frogs were found happily living in Asian elephant dung. And of course, it's excellent fertilizer. Many plant species grow better in elephant dung than in poop from any other animal. Their wide roaming and variation in movement make them especially good at spreading seeds to new places. But you don't have to be as big as an elephant to have a jumbo-sized impact on your ecosystem. Parrotfish are named for their tough, almost beak-like mouth parts. These hardened lips are well adapted for plucking algae off coral, their main food source in their warm reef environment. It might not be glamorous, but it turns out to be vital to keeping the reef healthy. Without parrotfish, Macroalgae can smother the coral to the point of killing it off. And no coral means no reef, which would be big trouble for these species that call coral reefs home. A major report covering 4 decades of research in the Caribbean identified parrotfish as a group to keep a special eye on. Coral reefs are generally having a tough time of it, with climate change, ocean acidification, and pollution steadily degrading the ecosystem. The parrotfish's maintenance work helps keep reefs resilient so that they can recover from blows like sudden heating or a hurricane. Caribbean reefs, where the parrotfish are heavily fished, are suffering the most. So the report recommends more countries adopt policies to save the parrotfish and hopefully save the reefs along with it. So like all keystone species, they really hold their ecosystems together. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow, which was brought to you by our patrons on Patreon. If you want to help support this show, go to patreon.com/scishow, and don't forget to go to youtube.com/scishow and subscribe.
Although there are many examples of keystone species, that video does a really good job with those 3 examples that they included, demonstrating the importance a keystone species has to its habitat. When a keystone species population is reduced or lost entirely, it can have dramatic, long-reaching consequences well beyond its local habitat. Trophic cascades, those feeding relationships, can be disrupted, ultimately causing widespread ecosystem dysfunction. Another special category of organisms is ecosystem engineers. If we were to make a Venn diagram of keystone species and ecosystem engineers, there would be a lot of overlap between them. Ecosystem engineers are special, however, because of the way in which they physically modify, through their behaviors, their habitat. Their behaviors may end up creating or destroying habitat, or even maintaining habitats for other organisms to benefit from over the long term. Because of the way in which they physically modify their habitat, those modifications end up having ripple effects for the entire area in which they occupy. They're critical in supporting and maintaining healthy ecosystems and the balance that's necessary for all organisms within an ecosystem to thrive. Some examples of ecosystem engineers include beavers that build dams, creating new habitat for a variety of species upstream of the dam, as well as downstream. In the video that we just watched, we saw that elephants are keystone species and they also act as ecosystem engineers. The coral that grows in the ocean in certain places acts as a habitat for a wide variety of a number of other organisms that live there. And of course, perhaps one of the most important and most consequential ecosystem engineer species are us. No other species on Earth modifies in a physical way a habitat more than humans do. All ecosystems have the same basic components and function in essentially the same way. All ecosystems have some kind of organism, like a producer, that can introduce energy into a trophic structure. All ecosystems have decomposers that can recycle nutrients. All ecosystems must abide by the laws of thermodynamics. But ecosystem organization on a larger scale can actually vary depending on the biodiversity within it. For example, an ecosystem with a high level of biodiversity oftentimes isn't going to be affected due to the loss of a particular species. Think about this example. In a really biodiverse ecosystem, there would be hundreds or maybe even thousands of different kinds of producers. Thousands of different kinds of plants, algae perhaps, bacteria that are carrying out photosynthesis to incorporate energy into living things. The loss of any one given species is probably not going to have an immediate effect on the entire ecosystem because there are so many others that are carrying out that exact same role. We can use examples of consumers in the same way. A really biodiverse ecosystem may have hundreds of different kinds of herbivores. So, if one particular herbivore suffers a decline or a loss, that isn't necessarily going to have catastrophic effects on the rest of the trophic structure, because there are so many other herbivores that can take up the responsibility of the one that's now missing. So, looking at the abundance of a species in a habitat is generally a poor indicator of how important it is. In order to truly understand how an ecosystem is organized, we have to observe special kinds of species like the engineers and the keystone species. We also have to observe how organisms interact with each other, how they prey on one another, how they parasitize one another, how they work with one another, in order to determine an individual organism's significance in a habitat. A good way to bring this video to a close, I think, is to take a quick review of what systems are. Systems are collections of interconnected parts and processes that work together toward a common goal or function. We can look at artificial systems like cars and planes, or cell phones and computers. Even ballpoint pens are systems. Each of those products has a collection of parts that all have different responsibilities to do, yet work toward a common functionality or a common goal. The ink in the reservoir of the pen, the spring in the clicker part, even the little steel ball that's at the end of that ink reservoir are all necessary in order for that ballpoint pen to function the way that it's supposed to. Biological systems can include the very, very tiny, like chemical pathways and reactions, for example, the ones that make up glycolysis, or even cells. Cells, in fact, are the smallest biological systems. Cells are used to make tissues, tissues to make organs, organs to make organ systems, and a collection of organ systems to make an entire organism. Of course, then we can take a variety of organisms, put them together in a common habitat, and that's where we get our ecosystems from, and ultimately the entire biosphere, all life on Earth. And here's the really critical part about systems and its relationship to biodiversity. Quite simply, the more complex the system, the more difficult it becomes to make accurate predictions about how changing a part of that system affects its overall function. Simple systems make it easier to have accurate predictions. Use the ballpoint pen as an example. If we were to remove the ink from the reservoir of a ballpoint pen, we can make a pretty easy, obvious prediction about how that pen is going to function or not. Remove the steel ball at the end of that ink reservoir, and we can make a pretty simple prediction about how that ballpoint pen is going to continue to function. But in an ecosystem where there are hundreds, thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of different kinds of species, and then there are numerous abiotic factors like light and temperature and water, and all of these components of the system are all interacting with each other, and sometimes in ways that aren't super obvious to us, it's really challenging for us to have an idea of what the overall consequences are when we disrupt that system, or any given part of that system. It's difficult for us to study as well because, although we may have computer modeling that can help us to make predictions, in order to truly understand what the consequences are of disruptions to an ecosystem, the disruption has to actually occur, which means damaging the ecosystem's function. Thank you for watching this video. Until next time.